I would definitely say not all kink is healing. Not all BDSM is healing. I don't think it needs to be healing to be valuable. But for some people, and I count myself among them, healing is kind of one of our kinks.
Hey, curious people, you're listening to the Self Led in Bed podcast, where we explore our fascinating internal sexual landscapes and discover our authentic sexual selves. I'm your host, Patricia Rich, a certified internal family systems and sex therapist, coach, and creator of the Self Led Sexuality model for healing, pleasure, and empowerment. I've spent the last 30 years helping people to develop fulfilling relationships with themselves and others. If you're ready for some warm, smart, and juicy conversations, me and my parts invite you and your parts to get cozy and settle in. Bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, sadomasochism can bring up lots of parts for participants and for therapists, and for some is an avenue towards self-leadership. I've been wanting to explore this topic on the podcast for a long time, and I'm glad that Leonore Tjia agreed to join me for this profound exploration of what has become an increasingly popular practice that is often poorly understood by those outside the community. Leonore Tjia is a queer Chinese American associate marriage and family therapist based in Vermont. She has worked in the field of adult sexuality education since 2011 with a focus on erotic embodiment, consent, and transformative BDSM. She holds a master's degree in counseling psychology and has studied and trained in a variety of healing modalities, including internal family systems, theater of the oppressed, and the somatic arts form Body Tales. Through her private practice, Rewild Your Heart, she helps people restore the dignity, power, and aliveness of their erotic selves. Please be aware that this episode contains explicit discussions of BDSM, power exchange, trauma, and sexuality. Listener discretion and care for your parts is recommended. Hello, Leonore, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
So, I'm really excited to have a conversation with you today about IFS and BDSM. I get a lot of questions that come up in this area, this intersection. It's so interesting, and I think there's so much for everyone to learn about power dynamics, and there's a lot of levels at which I think this will be a very relatable topic, whether or not listeners are familiar with BDSM. And we will dive into lots of things. But before we do that, I just wanted to give you a chance to maybe notice any parts that are here as we get started.
Yeah, I'm noticing that I'm feeling excited. And yeah, I put on like a fun outfit for this interview with you, which I think was a good move because I feel like it's getting me into a good headspace. Yeah. So my high-heeled parts are in the room.
Awesome. And I notice as you say that, how true that is for me also. Like I always, sometimes I just feel like I am the way I am. And then something as intentional as changing my clothes and preparing for something a certain way can shift me into like a whole different energy, a whole different part or access
Totally.
to self energy, whatever that might be. So, how about if you share a little bit about where you are in the world and any identities you'd want people to know about?
Sure. I live in Vermont on Abenaki land, and my kind of professional world as a therapist is based in California, where I went to grad school and decided to get licensed. Though I work with people all over the world as well through coaching. And identity wise, I'm queer and I'm identify as polyamorous. I'm kinky and I'm biracial. I'm mixed white and Chinese. Yeah, and neurodivergent.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And as we're kind of moving into this topic, I guess I'm curious about how you first encountered IFS and then how that fits into this whole area that we're going to explore for you.
Sure. Yeah. So a little bit of background on my story is I started working as a sex educator pretty early in my 20s through a connection I had in a women's community that I was part of and kind of entered this world of adult sexuality education. So that gave me the opportunity to explore BDSM and really come into my own identities as a queer and non-monogamous person. So there was a lot of identity work going on and a lot of change. And in the middle of that, I had done like a little bit of talk therapy, but hadn't really connected with the therapist. And it didn't feel like it was really meeting me where I wanted and needed to go. I happened to ask my aunt, who's a psychologist, I asked her, when you go to therapy, what kind of therapy do you do? And I just like remember her smile. She said, internal family systems. It's completely revolutionized my understanding of therapy. And I was like, well, that's high praise. It really made me curious. So at that point, with like some in the emotional challenges I was experiencing at the time in my mid 20s, I had this moment of like, I really need to find some more support for myself. And my aunt helped me look at the what was then the Center of Self Leadership's website and found an IFS therapist in my little town in Vermont. And I still remember my first session with her and how life changing it was.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's awesome. Yeah, I really love hearing how people got here. And there's been a few people who have gotten to IFS through family members.
Hmm.
And I find that especially, I don't know, moving in some way, maybe
Totally.
the generational gifts.
Definitely. Yeah, it's made all the family holidays really interesting as we could hole up in the side room and talk about the parts of us that were coming up.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Nice.
Mhm.
Yeah. We'd need a lot more plates at the table, right? For all the parts.
Definitely.
Yeah. And do you want to say something about your own discovery of BDSM? I don't know if you want to share on the
Sure.
personal side, and then we'll get
Hmm.
into maybe explaining a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, I can remember, first reading about and encountering BDSM on the internet more in kind of like I think there's something to be said for like the amount of BDSM community that started in the early days of the internet through like text-based message forums. And I was kind of reading about that and just like learning about that honestly as a teenager. And more than anything, I remember just being so fascinated by the frameworks of like consent and communication that were being talked about. So different from anything I'd heard about before, and certainly very different from my own introduction to partner sexuality, which was not very, there was not nearly enough communication, or really like mindful, like opting into things. It was more, I think, the experience that a lot of people kind of have, where it just felt like a thing that was like happening instead of something I was consciously exploring. It remained a part of like an area of just curiosity for me and wasn't something I really had the opportunities to explore outside of, just sort of fantasies and reading until I was in my 20s and was in this time in my life where I started to be able to explore communities, explore rope bondage gatherings, kink gatherings that were really education focused and that were accessible and open to the public. Yeah, I remember showing up to like a rope bondage gathering and I grew up in New York and I was like, oh, I'm gonna dress up and like, like look like I know what I'm doing, I guess. And I show up to this like rope bondage intro workshop in Vermont, and everyone's just like in their sweatshirts and Carhartts, and I was like, I'm a little bit missing the mark here. And I remember they asked me, oh, what's your name? And I said, Leonore. And then I was like, should I be giving a different name? Like, I didn't, should I be like giving a fake name? But I actually found everyone really warm and welcoming. So I just made some friends in that space, and they really became my first kink mentors and helped me, have my first experiences and begin to understand what I liked and was drawn to.
Nice. Yeah. Um, so for someone new to BDSM, I think BDSM is a huge world and there's so many different things. And also people often arrive who have not had a lot of experience with it, with what they might have picked up from books and movies and things like that. And I don't know if you could give us sort of a kind of mile high view here.
Sure.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. So BDSM, it's usually taught through the acronym. So I'll just say what that is. BDSM stands for, it's like three combinations of letters. So bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, and sadism and masochism. I would say it is both a set of practices. It's for some people an orientation, it's a community, and also a subculture in which people explore consensual power exchange and sadism and masochism. So using sensation and intense sensation and sometimes pain for what I would call erotic gratification. Not all of BDSM involves sex, as most people define it. The clothes might even stay on. There might not be any genital activity at all. It can be like a purely psychological or mental way of engaging. But I would say that it's erotically gratifying in that it is based in things that it's about exploring our interests, our erotic fixations, our kinks, and the roles and rituals and symbols that excite us and animate us and make us feel more alive.
That's great. Great description. I love
Thanks.
that. Yeah. Um, and again,
So, for some people, this is something that's very much contained inside a relationship where they explore roles and power dynamics and physical, erotic, and sexual experiences with a partner. For some people, this really might be more community based as well, where they go to events, some of which are publicly accessible, events that you can buy tickets to. Some of the most publicly well known and accessible BDSM events in the US are produced through a group called Dark Odyssey. Or they might also be privately organized events and parties in which people are invited on a case by case sort of referral basis. In these gatherings, people meet, socialize, and also get to know one another and share their kinks, their erotic interests, develop compatibility or explore compatibility, and then might choose to play, which is the term that people use for basically doing BDSM activities together. Play happens inside a scene, which is a prescribed container in which everything is negotiated, the activities, the sort of experiences that people like to have, and boundaries are set as well as the parameters for physical and emotional psychological safety. So people play inside scenes and then after wrapping up, usually do some aftercare which is usually decided upon in the negotiation. And yeah, at a BDSM party, at a kink party or gathering, you might have the opportunity to do as many scenes as you want and have capacity for. So for people who are part of BDSM communities, going to events like this is often a big part of how they, meet and form relationships and enjoy themselves. And then there's also, of course, online BDSM communities as well.
yeah, so lots of different ways to start, if people are curious, and then people can be, exploring this in a lot of different ways. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess something I'm aware of is I know when I work with therapists, like there's a huge range of people's experience and exposure with this. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it can cause a lot of reaction for the
Mm-hmm.
therapist. And someone might be coming in
Mm-hmm.
who has a lifestyle of BDSM, but that's not even the thing they want to talk about particularly.
Right.
But
Mm-hmm.
if the, therapist is hearing certain things and getting concerned or maybe even worried, like then that can come in and, enter the room too. Or on the other hand,
Mm-hmm.
maybe can be an enthusiast and maybe not catch the nuance of what this particular person's experience is with some of these
Mm-hmm.
practices. So,
Mm-hmm.
jumping ahead a little bit, but I'm just, I guess, maybe wanting to invite listeners to sort of notice kind of where are they. You might want to locate yourselves in terms of how familiar you already are with, so, the things Leonore is sharing. Where are you curious? Where do you notice maybe some some worry or judgment coming in because this is all just, a way to get to know our own system as well as to be there more in whatever role, we're in with other people. So,
Totally.
yeah. So would you say that BDSM can be a safe practice for people, and what makes it be that?
One of the core tenets of ethical BDSM play is being risk aware. There's an acronym in the community, RAC, which stands for Risk Aware Consensual Kink, which has sort of been the evolution of the original moniker of SSC, meaning safe, sane, and consensual. So, can BDSM be a safe place of exploration? Absolutely. And I think it's as safe as the people inside the scene can be, and as safe as we can be for ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then that may bring in our parts. And this is something that's, you probably know, a big passion of mine is like, who's consenting, right? Like, so if you're negotiating, which parts of us are the ones that are saying yes? Are there any parts inside that aren't being consulted? How well are different parts being represented in the negotiation of the scene?
Yeah, definitely. I think BDSM is a space where people explore a kind of layered agency, like in scenes with power exchange where there's a dominant and submissive dynamic going on. There is on one hand a conscious intentional forfeiture of some level of agency on behalf of the submissive and of passing that agency and power and authority over to the dominant and inviting them to hold it and embody it for the duration of the scene. And there's this phrase that comes up sometimes in talking about power exchange about how ideally the submissive really holds the power in the scene. I would say I see it a little differently. I think ideally power exchange is a co-created experience and a space of mutual recognition where the dominant person also uh, the person holding the dominant role is should also be playing inside their own space of consent and full consciousness and being able to really access their yes and no. Because people in dominant roles or sadistic roles can sometimes deal with finding that they've done things that have crossed some of their own boundaries. And that might not have actually harmed the other person, but it might have created an experience inside themselves that they don't feel comfortable with. So ideally, we're exploring always our yeses, our nos, understanding our maybes, understanding what a full yes really is, working on our ability to communicate that and to create that space of full mutual recognition.
That's very interesting and powerful, this idea and, that people might cross their own boundaries and maybe not even realize it. I would
Mm-hmm.
imagine. Do you see that often as like a backlash or sort of a delayed response that comes up for people in certain roles and maybe even say more about a sadistic role? Can you explain that a little
Sure.
bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're going to be someone who explores the erotic and explores your own sexuality, I think we need to normalize that we often, we might not know where the limits are until we cross one. And it's not uncommon, I think, to have people maybe when exploring something new to them that they don't have a lot of context for, to deal with ambivalence about that or to deal with parts that have different feelings about it. Maybe the part that kind of really has that kink was able to feel gratified in exploring a deeply held fantasy and being able to bring that out into the light. But maybe other parts of you feel quite conflicted and don't really know how to process or integrate that experience. With sadism and masochism is really about I would say sadism is the enjoyment of the taking pleasure from inflicting. some kind of intense sensation on the other person. And I'm really borrowing Midori's language here. She's an amazing Japanese American kink educator based out of San Francisco. She teaches a women's dominance intensive called Forte Femme, which I took with her. She really uses the language of intense sensation to point out that, a lot of people will say, "Oh, I don't like pain. I'm not into pain." That the idea of that turns them off. But she'll say, like, "Well, have you ever been bitten, or scratched during sex and found that you actually kind of liked it?" In a space of arousal, we might find that we're really actually into things that we're not into otherwise. That space of arousal can transform the sensations. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily feel like pain the way we usually process pain. It also could be delivering intense sensation in the form of pleasure. So forcing someone to kind of orgasm over and over again, or to experience more pleasure than they've been able to feel before, sort of using that power to inflict that on someone. If you find that you're maybe turned on or gratified by that, I would call that a sadistic impulse.
Interesting. Yeah. Um, and yeah, so there's sort of a spectrum there, it sounds like, in terms of intensity,
Mhm.
of the
Definitely.
experience of intensity, and then the power dynamic that would go along with the experience of intensity. And I
Yes.
really also appreciate what you're saying about, and I think it's true of lots of things, but especially here, like we just don't know often what our limits and boundaries are until we've crossed them. And if we're always keeping ourselves careful, and I know I have a lot of parts that tend toward carefulness, over time, you can have a lot, just be living in a much smaller space,
Hmm.
than you could be.
Hmm.
And I know, yeah, it's yeah. And then that's where the communication skills come in and the aftercare and all of that, I'm sure.
Definitely. And if I were to really borrow from Midori's model of how she talks about kink, she actually conceptualizes power exchange, so dominance and submission, as existing on a different axis from sadism and masochism. So the way she describes it, you can have intense sensation without necessarily a power dynamic. You can also have power exchange, the dominance and submission, without sensation or without pain. And I think that's important to point out too, because often in sort of pop culture and mainstream discourse about them, these terms are conflated. For example, in 50 Shades of Grey, I hate that I have to bring up this film, but I will. Christian Grey says, "I'm a dominant." And then Anastasia says, "Well, what does that mean?" And they go on to talk about it. He talks about, "I like inflicting pain." And so it's just, my guy, that's not dominance, that's sadism.
Mhm.
Dominance is about the getting off on having power over someone, having authority, holding that authority and control. Submission is about arousal through yielding that. And you can actually have, as I said, power exchange without the sensation element. You could have dominance and submission that's actually quite loving, quite romantic. That doesn't involve pain or degradation. It could be quite more a dynamic of creating sort of the experience of cherishing someone, but still with that power dynamic. And I think there's a lot of interesting connections to attachment there as well.
Can you say more about that?
I think in dominance and submission, we're playing with things like idealization. And for the submissive, it's very arousing. It's very tantalizing to have someone hold power over you, the experience of a sort of omnipotent, idealizable other who holds authority, who determines whether you're good and bad. There's a lot of playing with goodness and badness in DS. Good girl, good boy, or have you been a bad boy? Punishment, affirmation, praise, service, all those sorts of things. And I think inside submission, there can be it's a chance to explore feelings of dependency and to sort of regress into perhaps younger parts of us, or, yeah, younger parts of us that remember what it's like to have people around us hold power over us. I think it brings out a lot of things about how honestly our first experiences of power dynamics are often with our parents and with our family. And inside those family experiences, there are templates that can be created around belonging, approval, shame, recognition, worthiness, and often those templates can be, maybe not often, but they certainly can be eroticized, and they are very potent because they come from young parts of us. These developmental experiences are very potent, and so playing them out erotically can be very powerful.
There's so many things coming up here that I'm curious about, and also that I've seen, like that people can do a lot of repair. Like it feels like within these agreements, there can be room to really go back and kind of redo different kinds of relationships and really, like I'm interested in the whole idea of blending parts, from an IFS perspective, like embodying a part, taking on a role, like how
Mm-hmm.
much that can be healing. At what point is it maybe perpetuating
Mm-hmm.
um, pain? But then with an erotic, I guess there's the erotic element and then the psychological element
Mm-hmm.
um, that don't always go together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of reenactment that happens through BDSM. I think a lot of repetition, certainly. And definitely there can be repair if you want to have an experience of being held in a way that you never got held. You can negotiate that. If you want the experience of being able to cathartically, release intensity that was never welcomed or met, you can negotiate that. If you want the experience of stepping into and embodying a part of you that for which you have been rejected and judged, and you want to be able to bring that in and have people respond to you in a different way, you can do that. And I think that it's a really interesting place of playing with parts and also kind of playing with burdens too.
Mhm.
I would definitely say not all kink is healing. Not all BDSM is healing. I don't think it needs to be healing to be valuable. But for some people, and I count myself among them, healing is kind of one of our kinks. So it kind of plays a big role in the sorts of play we're drawn to.
Mhm. Okay, so you were mentioning burdens and playing with burdens, and I guess that made me think about humiliation. Do some parts kind of get off or come alive with something, and then is that perhaps harming other parts that are like, does it add to the burden for some parts while it's maybe expressing the burden or offering an opportunity for excitement for other parts?
I think I know what you're talking about. It's good that we're talking about this in the context of like humiliation, erotic degradation. I think this can come up a lot. Yeah, I would say I think that's playing with parts that, or playing with parts, areas of our system where there can be a lot of polarizations and conflicts, like perhaps in perhaps in the bedroom, I want to feel degraded in a certain way. I want to feel humiliated and belittled in a certain way. That doesn't necessarily mean that I want to feel that way in the rest of my life. But it can be hard when there are parts of us that are really carrying these burdens of like worthlessness and shame, and other parts that don't want us to feel that in our day-to-day life and are resisting that. In my experience, the bigger the burden inside the system, the more sort of polarization and conflict there's going to be around it, around these sorts of core worthlessness stuff. There's the burden itself, there are the exiles carrying the burden, there are the protectors around the burden, around the exile, that are keeping that part compartmentalized so as to not interfere with day-to-day functioning. But there's often still like the internalized, the inner critic, like the protectors that have also become burdened, that still inject shaming voices into the system. And and those sort of the loops of internal shaming. I've certainly benefited a lot from IFS therapy and sort of shrinking and healing that inner critic and being able to connect with its protective intentions, the way it wants me to be safe, to be welcomed, to be approved of, and kind of reassigning its role to not have to be so harsh and punitive, and to be able to just sort of release and wash away the shame underneath it, that was driving those harsh behaviors. Um, I think still, though, there might still be parts of us that really do get off on being shamed, and belittled. I think about this in the cultural context where we live, for example. I think about the women that I know who are into erotic humiliation, for example, through a kind of role play or like a kink that's called bimbofication. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, it's been in the news lately.
It has been in the news. Bimbofication is having a cultural moment. Bimbofication is it's in stepping into that bimbo part, I think there is kind of a regression or a blending with these sort of shallow parts. There's a loss of intellect, a surrendering of control, of composure, of even indignity, maybe, right? And sort of a surrendering to this kind of hypersexual objectification, right? It's a surrendering to the objectification and a delighting in it. And is that, granted, the way in which it's appearing in the news is sort of complex, but ultimately, is that really a bad thing to find a space in your life where you can surrender to the more uncontrolled, undignified, hypersexual elements of being alive and release the conflict that's often there around needing to, be smart, respectable, in control, to find actually a safe space where you can set that aside temporarily? I think that's relieving for a lot of people. I think it's relieving to be able to find some space from that and just be able to like relish in the eroticism if that truly appeals to you. So yeah, I mean, I think whether or not it's really the psychological impact that has on the whole system is going to depend a lot on that person and the nature of their system, the kinds of burdens that are there, and the level of, I think, of self that's also present, and how much we can like witness and accept these parts of ourselves.
So yeah, so you're bringing kind of self energy into the conversation here, and self leadership, and um you know that when we have extremes in our system, they can swing back and forth so completely we don't know the other is even there,
Mhm.
right? And it feels like when there's opportunities to really be with both, sides of the polarization. This is basic IFS stuff, but I think in our sexuality, people often are pretty locked into one side, and
Mhm.
the other one is really cordoned off, at least in our public personas, and
Mhm.
then so I guess I'm curious for you, in your work as a therapist, do people explore these kinds of things with you? Or are they kind of sometimes coming to you to process things that they've experienced, that they're still digesting, or to like create ideas for scenes that they would want to
Mhm.
explore?
Yeah, I would say I have a range in my practice of how involved people are with this. Some are, deep BDSM practitioners who maybe aren't even wanting to really process stuff about BDSM in therapy, as you brought up earlier. Maybe it's just wanting to have a therapist who understands this part of their life, and it's not new to me. I definitely have clients who are exploring, have some experience or curious about and kind of dipping toes into the water and wanting support in exploring while still being able to stay fully connected to themselves and fully connected to their yes and no and maybe. That's definitely a big part of what I support them around. I also have people who aren't actively involved in a BDSM community or relationship, but who are in therapy exploring a lot of stuff about their relationship to power and also to shame. And they might not necessarily be thinking about those things in terms of a kink context. But kink is a framework that I try to use to help people make these dynamics more legible to themselves.
And do you see, I guess I see a lot of mixed orientation kinds of relationships where one person really wants to explore these things through the lens of kink or through the
Mm-hmm.
practices of kink, and there's a partner who's not open or available for that.
Mm-hmm.
And then that can become quite a source of tension in the relationship.
Totally. Yeah. How do you work with that when that comes up in your practice?
I mean, it depends if I'm seeing both people or I'm seeing the person who's the frustrated person, more frustrated with, well, I guess both people might be frustrated, but a person who's wanting to explore. And what I find is that a lot of people appreciate an opportunity to hold space for all of their own parts because they may feel like they can only spend time with certain parts of themselves if their partner is all in on the same thing. And so I don't want to say that what we do internally is a substitute or, it's going to meet every need that we might have to explore things in the outer world or with other people. But it can be surprising, I think, to people how much room they can create inside just to be with all other parts, the parts that want different things and have different fantasies, and, to really be with that. And then sometimes, really getting a bunch of layers deeper about what the need is, like the real hunger, even beneath the specifics of the way they're imagining fulfilling it. And
Right.
sometimes there's something that can emerge from that is more amenable to a partner. Like really what I want is to be held and, not have to make a decision and there may be ways to break it down, that there's some middle ground with a partner. And sometimes there's not, there's like a more of a clarity. Gosh, this is really important to me. This is really, making me more clear that we're not, what are we going to do because we're just not compatible
We're
in
not
this way.
compatible. Yeah. And maybe this is something that I truly do need for myself and need to prioritize more. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. And then the question comes up with trauma. We're talking about consent and, all these things take a lot of self-energy, I think, to really, and especially in a very charged or even very dramatic kind of setting or context, to really be able to slow down, to notice ourselves, to notice what we want and need. And folks who've had a lot of trauma may really, have complex systems where
Hmm.
it's hard to do that, if not impossible.
Hmm.
So I'm just wondering if you have any ways you like to guide people or suggest to people that they care for themselves if they have complex trauma.
Totally. Yeah. Well, some things I want to say about that are firstly, I just want to acknowledge that kink is always sort of defined as being in contrast to like normal, and I'm really putting that in quotes, normal sexuality or normative sexuality, right? That's sort of the original meaning of kink is like it's not straight, it's kinky, like it's bent.
Mhm.
So really like a strong contrast there. But I think it's also important to point out that there are still power dynamics in quote unquote normal sexuality, what the BDSM world would call the vanilla world. There are still often power dynamics inside the world of vanilla dating and sex, just as the dominatrix is sort of revered as this archetype, this kinky archetype. When I look at the world of mainstream heterosexual sex and dating, what my heterosexual clients report to me, and just sort of the things that pop up on the main pages of heterosexual porn, I actually see a lot of power stuff playing out. And sometimes, honestly, it looks pretty sadomasochistic to me too. So I don't think that not being in BDSM necessarily makes this any easier. I think also that, it's important to point out like, yes, there are some people who are both have trauma and are kinky. They're not necessarily into kink because of their trauma. Like, I don't think that involvement in BDSM is sort of a reflection of being sexually broken due to trauma. And the research does uphold that. Although, certainly for some people, their trauma is something they engage with consciously in a kink format. There are also people who have trauma who are not drawn to exploring BDSM. So it's pretty multidimensional landscape there. I really think that inside all of this, the work of getting really in touch with yes and no and maybe inside ourselves is just paramount. I know that you interviewed Dr. Betty Dodson, the creator of The Wheel of Consent.
Betty
Oh, excuse
Martin.
me, Betty Martin. Yeah, not Betty Dodson,
I would
another
have loved to have
sexuality.
gotten Betty Dodson on, but
I know.
she is no more.
If only. Shout out to Betty Dodson. That would have been a great interview.
Yeah.
But yeah, but Dr. Betty Martin's work on The Wheel of Consent. And I think that's so important, really understanding what consent is inside ourselves and how we navigate all these dimensions is just so critically important. I also want to acknowledge that, like, for some people, like, trauma has shaped us in ways where our ability to truly feel our yes has just become compromised and undermined. I work with a lot of people who have pretty strong fawning responses. And sometimes, the more work we do, it's like the more recognition there is that, wow, I've basically been living my whole life like in the fawning shape. This isn't just something I do sometimes. It's really like a way in which I move through the world. And there can be a lot of grief there. It is a layered process to create enough safety to be able to relax those survival impulses and get more in touch with more attuned to our own experience. So I really think it's an ongoing, layered process. I think understanding trauma can be a gift to ourselves. I think becoming intimate and familiar with our survival strategies and the way we might fawn or freeze, as well as flee or fight, can be so helpful in understanding our responses to these things. And I just think like creating that self-led space of like really witnessing ourselves, witnessing and creating a lot of acceptance. Like when those questions come up of how do I know if this is coming from my trauma or if it's not, we really may not know. It often is not a binary thing, right? It's not a yes or no, but through increasing our acceptance of ourselves, the recognition that we don't need to search for some kind of like purity in ourselves that's completely free from trauma, in order for an experience to be worthy or good. It's really our attunement to ourselves, our acceptance of ourselves, our ability to embody our experience from the inside out and not feel that we're just performing, or surveilling ourselves, spectating ourselves. All of that is our steps on the process of healing, I think.
It's so powerful. Just very appreciate the nuance there, all the nuances there. Um, Really, yeah, that the consciousness around consent and the intentionality is, I think, can make this kind of exploration so much safer and more meaningful
Mm-hmm.
in a context where these things are being explored and named explicitly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to your point, a lot of people are doing things and choking comes to mind, or like
Yeah.
different practices they've maybe kind of learned through, that have maybe come out of the world of BDSM but are not being
Mm-hmm.
applied with the level of skill and
Mm-hmm.
preparation and training that people need in order to do them safely. So I think, just being just in what's become sort of normative or heteronormative sexual engagement, there's, a lot of things out there that can be very complicated.
Definitely. Yeah. We can't also dispute that we live inside patriarchy where, we already live in a society where gendered power dynamics are absorbed into absolutely everything, including our understanding of sexuality, and romance. And I'm glad that you brought up choking as well, because that's, yeah, I know someone close to me who, experienced an injury in a breath play scene while being choked, and have appreciated how they've gone on to talk about, what they've like learned through their experience. But it's important to point out that like there are real risks inside this. Education is important. Safety protocols are important. Knowing our limits are important. I think slowing down and not going to the most extreme thing is also important.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I guess something else coming to mind for me is, like our sexuality is a valuable resource in the system, and different parts might want to engage with it in different ways or may have jobs in relation to it of
Mhm.
different types, so, there's, like you were saying, there could be a healing, some sort of healing agenda. There could be a numbing and escaping, just being able to get away from everything agenda, right? So then there's could be sort of the soother firefighter domain, could be a lot very alive. There's the managerial, like being in control, intentionally being in control or intentionally choosing not to be in control. I just think like all the parts could be engaged in different ways, and like the different jobs different parts have could all potentially be manifesting in different ways at different times in this world.
Definitely.
Uh,
Hmm.
and I hear, do you use kink and BDSM synonymously? I know some people differentiate those from each other.
Yeah, I do it colloquially just because, in the world I'm in, they're used as synonyms. Yeah, I mean, one difference I see is I think kinky gets used as an adjective sometimes to just mean sort of any transgressive sexual desire or practice. I have a memory of a few years ago, some friends that I knew went to the Hump Porn Festival in San Francisco, Dan Savage's Porn Festival. And one of the porn categories, this is for folks who don't know, this is a festival where people make and shoot DIY porn and then it's screened in like a big theater. One of the categories was kinky, and my friends were telling me about one of the films was a fisting scene. And afterwards, one of them turned to the other and said, "That was hot, but what was kinky about that?" Because for them, being like people who are very deep in the BDSM community, fisting was a sexual act that is maybe seen as unusual or transgressive to the normative audience. But there was no power exchange or sadomasochism going on, So I think on a core level, if I think of like what really makes something BDSM play and not just sort of like a spicy, sort of role play, the way, you might like dress up as like a kinky nurse or something for Halloween. Is that really kink? Is that kinky? Some people might call it kinky, but in my mind, it's not truly BDSM because I think BDSM goes to this deeper place of transgressing autonomy. Power exchange involves a forfeiture, a transgression of autonomy psychologically. And sadomasochism involves like the transgression of bodily autonomy. And in, BDSM scenes are a place where we sort of ideally consensually dramatize and play out these things.
Is there more you would want to say about how people can own their erotic selves through these practices?
Yeah, I feel like I've been talking a lot. I'm kind of curious to hear if anything comes up from you around this
Yeah.
after hearing
Yeah. I love
after our
hearing
conversation.
questions. Yeah.
Mhm.
If you have anything you want to ask me, I welcome that too, because sometimes it helps me get things out.
Yeah. Well, I know,
I'm curious
coming
about.
from your place of expertise around self-led sexuality, what are some ways that you see like BDSM and, these exploring these things, like helping people to get in touch with their parts?
Yeah, I've had a lot of people who have experienced childhood sexual abuse find themselves again through sometimes sort of like master slave type relationship, like really being able to, I don't know, it would be different from person to person and, all the details of it, but like there is something about just like I feel like sometimes like the healing that people do around their sexuality in a therapy context is not inclusive enough of the erotic elements of their early life experiences. And that's true of sexual abuse. And I think just family relationships, like just even core attachment stuff, like there's a level of eroticism. I think the Freudians would talk about that more than kind of the current, major approaches to
Yeah.
therapy. We've really gotten away from that. And, children are deeply erotic. And, it's like the times when I've been really able to drop into myself and really embody like my very young parts, it's like, shocking almost, how alive that eroticism is in my body when I'm embodying some of those parts. And I think that's true for a lot of people. So specifically, definitely folks who've been able to kind of reconnect to their sexuality by being allowed to really embody that in a submissive role.
Do you ever find that people, like I was going to ask, were they embodying the master or the slave role? It sounds like kind of the slave, but do you find that people sometimes also like heal through embodying like the master or the dom or the perpetrator?
Yes, it's interesting as I'm thinking about it. The people that are coming to mind, let me see. Yeah, I would say for some reason the submissive is coming in stronger in terms of things that I've heard people tell me about. And that often they would, like for some people, they would take on the dominant role, but to me, it almost felt like a developmental process. Like they didn't start there and then they might evolve as they started to connect more with their sexuality and with their wounds and all of that into then almost like a more adolescent kind of stage and then exploring power and dominance. And really at that point being able to be, I think, a much more attuned dominant than almost like playing the role, but being so disconnected from their own sensitivity, based on their own burdens, that a lot of that healing work allowing them to step into that dominant role in a much more attuned way.
Totally. I love that you bring that up because I've seen that too, both in my kink communities and in my therapy practice of people who first needed to go into that like submissive role or masochistic role and really recreate the experience on their own terms and get the holding or the surrender that they're kind of seeking. Sometimes relive the degradation, but on their own terms or, whatever that core emotional thing was. And then, yeah, like kind of building it out to experience like play out different roles including being like the top or the sadist or dom. And I think that that can be so freeing to and can be like an experience of enlarging ourselves to play multiple different roles and not just feel constrained to one side, of it, like as Jessica Benjamin talked about with like feminist psychoanalysis, like that split that gets created around like being the doer or being done to, and ultimately like being like no, I can be any part in this, any role in this. I'm both like the writer, the producer, the director of this erotic theatrical experience my psyche is creating. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I I'm, I'm thinking about, and I don't remember if we already touched on this during the recorded portion of our conversation today, but when there's a dynamic where there's a part that is a sadistic part that is wanting to dominate a more vulnerable young part in the system, and that domination sort of serves a function for the system in a certain way. And this may play out in fantasy. I've definitely worked, with people around what happens in their own sexual system, and it may come out, in just fantasizing more generally or specifically during erotic self-play. It may come out there too. But it gets tricky sometimes, right? So there's like a part that's dominating another part, but the young part is suffering and doesn't like it. But then there's other parts that are very supportive of like when that dominant energy is there, it sort of serves the system in certain ways. And then
Mm-hmm.
there can be a fear of, will we lose all our agency? Like if this switches up, will we just be people can't even contemplate sometimes, like who would I be without this power dynamic going on inside me?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
that Have you ever, does that make sense to you?
Yeah. Do you mean like an inner critic part and like a part that's being criticized, or
It could be, or
you
even a part that in the fantasy, just really whips and mortifies the flesh of another
got it?
part.
Okay. So kind of like in kind of like a self-sadistic fantasy.
Like a
Yeah.
part, there's a sadistic part who is abusing or dominate. I mean, it may not be consensual, right? So if it's not
Right.
consensual, is that abusive? Like,
Hmm.
but then, yeah, there's a part that's being harmed,
Hmm.
or at least getting hurt, getting hurt.
Getting hurt. Yeah.
There's pain.
Yeah. What do you think healing looks like in that context?
Yeah, I think being with the system initially, just like how much space is there to turn toward this dynamic, so and that can take a lot. Sometimes people really don't want to look at that. Like they want to look at it, but they don't want to look at it. So there's polarizations around it. There can be a lot of fear of looking at that. And then the parts that like the sadistic part can really interrupt the process a lot if it doesn't, you know, want anything to get disrupted. So it can disrupt the process so that its own role doesn't get disrupted. But as it's this, kind of familiar IFS process, right? Like as there can be some negotiating, like how is this working well? How isn't this working well? Like what are you afraid would change? Like what if it didn't mean changing anything at all, but we just had a chance to kind of like listen and find out a little more from each of the parts. What do they like about what they're doing? What's good for them about it? What isn't working? So just all the different ways of trying to not come in with an agenda of changing it or having it be different, but coming in with a lot of curiosity and willingness to really hear out all the parts, and then gradually, getting deeper into the system. And so like this, if there's a sadistic part, really getting to know that part and how much is it a part in the person's own system that is, doing a job, it has a function, it has a role. Is it in some ways like I just spoke with Robert Falconer? So, he was talking about perpetrator introjects and,
Yeah.
what kind of energy is coming out of that part. And, is how much of a choice is it? How much is it
Right.
a natural part of the system? Did it come in from somewhere else? There
Hmm.
could be like a lot to sort through there. But if the one who is getting hurt in the process, I mean, sometimes when that part just feels appreciated, like it's actually and valued,
Hmm.
um, or like it has a choice for when it's available and when it isn't. Like there's a
Right.
lot of things that can shift that dynamic, or maybe that one doesn't even have to be around getting, maybe there's some way for it depends if it's the psychological aspect or the erotic aspect of it, but sometimes maybe some other part wants to step in or but it's like takes patience, I think, for the person exploring and for that it's really important that the therapist be very spacious to just really be with all these different energies and dynamics in like a very patient and open way.
Totally. And makes me think you're basically talking about the process of creating more negotiation and consent internally and like
Hmm.
maybe bringing aftercare,
Hmm.
to the
Yeah.
parts. The parts need aftercare. The parts need to have more negotiation, more choice, more consent. Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah. And something else that I think is very powerful is befriending the parts of the body,
Mm.
because often we have lots of parts that want to use the body in different ways. But when we start to really like ask a part of the body that's being impacted, how is this for you? If
Mm.
it's impact play, like how is this, can I befriend my buttocks? Can I like really feel into them and really feel how is this for you? And that can be threatening, to parts that don't want, if the
Mm.
buttocks are not liking maybe the
Hmm.
the level of impact. What does that mean in the system if you're engaging in internal consent?
Because I think that's about lessening the amount of dissociation that can happen, right? Of like sometimes there might be some dissociation happening in service of sort of the experience, but if we're not fully in touch with like the parts of our body that are our bodies that are really being played with and impacted. There can also be kinds of like overriding going on where the
Mhm.
experience gratifies some parts of us, but other parts of us are getting left behind.
So to speak.
Yeah, so to speak. Yeah.
And it might be that the same dynamic could happen without as much impact because when the
Mhm.
person's fully embodied, there doesn't need to be as much impact, to have the same effect.
The stimulation doesn't have to be as intense.
Hmm.
Yeah.
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 But, it can be challenging if it's like, say, the body part, in this case, say it's the butt, buttocks are like, I don't want this,
Yeah.
then
Mhm.
that can be very disruptive in the
Right.
system.
Hmm. We're kind of talking about how BDSM can be helpful to clients of therapy, but I'm curious if there are ways you think that these frameworks can also be helpful to clinicians.
Yeah. Well, one, I think just learning is helpful to clinicians. If this is new, if this is, I think I was saying before we started, I feel like I'm sort of at a medium, like there's, it hasn't been I haven't done a deep personal lived experience way deep into the world of BDSM, but I've, explored some things and worked with people and, I'd say it's somewhere in medium land. But I think as clinicians, just listening to this podcast, getting more oriented, number one, is really helpful. And I think in addition to the content, around consent and different practices and all that, I actually have been getting very curious about power dynamics just in the therapeutic relationship, not sexualized necessarily, although that can be the implicitly there sometimes. But how do I sit in my power? Or like if I have a client who doesn't let me lead, I've had a few clients like that where they're very dominant. They're led by a very dominant kind of managerial part. And sometimes I'll talk to that part, like my feeling is that you want to be in charge here. Am I reading that correctly? And starting to work with the parts around power and control. Mhm.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of power dynamics going on in therapy. And if we only see ourselves as sort of selfless healers who don't want to have power over people, we're actually probably missing a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also think there's something that can be kind of sadistic about our job. Like, it's our job to not only hold space for it, but sometimes this in a largely a good way, but kind of provoke people to feel intense things. Ideally, it's things they want to feel, you know? But I can't be the only therapist who like when clients really go there emotionally and start crying, like it feels good to some part of me, I'm like, yeah, go for it. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
in aligned in service of their goals and what they want, but I think there's some sadistic elements to therapy, to doing things that make people feel intense things, that that thing that's about helping people take off their masks and seeing what's underneath the mask and go to some place that's very, very real and vulnerable. I mean, that's kind of a sadistic
Mhm.
impulse in my mind. And I don't think that's a bad thing at all.
Yeah,
But
it's
I think,
interesting. Yeah.
I,
For me, I think it doesn't the word sadistic doesn't totally fit for me in that context, but it does
mhm,
very much resonate with like power in a sense of like, um, we have this way of helping people follow a certain path to get to some sort of sometimes cathartic experience. It isn't always that. But it can be this cathartic experience. And so it is like, there could be some level of gratification in that. Like,
totally,
yeah, I helped you get to the place,
totally.
you know,
Yeah,
um, and, there can be playfulness in it too, right? So if there's a protector who's like coy, or like, there's like, when we negotiate with a part and we kind of are like successful. I'm doing the air quote thing here too. Like we're sort of successful and the part allows something else to happen. I think that can feel gratifying to, some parts also.
totally. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I'm rethinking what I just said about the sadism, and I think there's some stigma, I think, around sadism, and that we don't see it as a good thing to like hurting people,
Mhm.
in our society, but using it more in a way that's truly, when it is aligned with what someone else wants. I think that it's
Mhm.
important to differentiate that from truly antisocial behavior. They're not the same thing. And I
Right.
guess, yeah, I would say, like, I mean, I think what I do in therapy is it's not it is not sadistic, but it does use some of the same inner capacities, I think, that kinky sadism does, in terms of like truly, like, really attuning to someone, and like really attuning to their reactions, and what is the impact of my words on their emotional state, and like, is this going the place where we want it to go, and when to amplify the emotion and when to soothe, when to give space and when to contain, like all of those things
Mhm. Yeah.
are
Yeah.
very much in that skill set.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense to me. And the dominance kind of resonates for me there.
Yeah, definitely. The
Yeah.
amount of attunement needed inside dominance. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious to actually run through the six S's for a minute in this context. Would you
Yeah,
be up for
please
that?
do. Yeah.
So, and again, this idea that our self energy has these success qualities, but also that parts may have roles, in relation to each of them. So if this idea is that our self energy is safe, and then we have parts that may have roles in discerning if things are safe for us and letting us know if they're not. So, it feels like all the discussion of consent and of being clear on the context that you're in and making choices that make sense in that context and noticing, like, do I, like, I think that question, it's really like continuing to check for self energy. Like, am I here along with the parts entering this experience? Does that resonate for you?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. So
Yeah.
I'm just like nodding because I'm totally agreeing with you.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. And then sensual could be this quality of self energy that when I'm really in my body, when my protectors have relaxed, there's actually something that feels good inside of me. Like that it sort of feels good to be me in this
Hmm.
moment in a certain way. And I'm also awake and present to sensations of, pleasure.
Hmm.
Um, and so if it's, and I like to say it doesn't have to only, people often think about the softer side of pleasure, right? The bubble bath and
The roses and candles and
roses and candles and things like that. But there can
Mhm.
also be a lot of pleasure in the scratching or the,
Totally.
like other kinds of sensation play. And
The
I think
more,
if we're disconnected, like to, like we might not be able to notice the sensuality of the experience.
yeah, right. Like the primal sides as well. And just the flow state that comes from being
Mhm.
truly fully awake to and present inside our
Mhm.
sensations. Yeah.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And really, without being present and in our bodies that way, it's pretty hard to say yes or no on behalf of the body parts and not just the kind of more psychological or mental drives,
Totally.
right?
Mhm.
And then spacious, am I feeling, it's an interesting one, right? So in terms of self energy, the, idea is that our self energy isn't limited. It's not in short supply, and it isn't even limited to the confines of our body. Like our self energy can be an expansive consciousness and what's between us and feeling spacious at different times. And it might be parts, that are blended, that are burdened, that have a lot of beliefs or inhibitions or, things that keep us in smaller, tighter boxes, right? But then there's also the pleasure that can come with constriction, right? And I'm actually thinking about ropes and shibari, like just all kinds of things, right? That there's often a lot of freedom. Like people can find spaciousness through its opposite. a lot of times.
Right. And, all the neurodivergent people for whom like compression is very regulating.
Hmm.
That makes me think also around just the parts of us that can come up inside negotiations,
Hmm.
where of course, ideally we're like fully connected to our yes and no, and that feels completely clean and integrated. But let's be real, we're all works in progress. It's not like
Yeah.
it's ever like just completely done. But really checking in with ourselves about, are there parts of me feel that don't feel fully spacious inside the negotiation. And it might not even be about being sort of coerced by the other person into a certain activity, but it might be more like, I don't want to let them down, or how I imagine they might react to me not wanting to do something, or this is my only chance. So I don't want to give up on the opportunity to explore this or whatever. There can be a lot of internal pressure that's created that interferes, so just really working with that ability to be truly spacious with ourselves inside negotiation. I think that's like
Hmm.
lifelong work for a lot of us.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. That's so important. Yeah, so lots of different ways that, and like we can feel spaciousness in constriction, or we could feel constricted in constriction, you know? So,
Totally.
yeah. And then sensitivity. So the idea that our self-energy, when we're able to really embody it, there's a level of perceptiveness and attunement. It's like, like as we deepen, like you were saying, sensations might feel different at a certain point, right? Like the sensitivity opens up even more. If there's another person involved, like the intensity of the psychological connection can get much deeper. I think it's sometimes like a flower, like the outer petals open and then the inner petals open, and so there's like more sensitivity, there's more exposed, there's more vulnerability,
Totally.
that
And
can open up.
yeah, it makes me think about how, like, in the world of like sensation play and sensory deprivation and overload, just putting on a blindfold can amplify other senses so much. Touch can become so like electric and immersive when you take sight or hearing away, for example. And there's a whole world of our sensations to be present to that can be so transporting.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's one that also sometimes for highly sensitive people is like too much. Like sometimes the sensitivity, like everything shuts down at that point, like because it's just too much, so there's a lot about how do we titrate that, for different bodies and different states of arousal. Yeah. And then steamy is the fifth S.
Nice.
Um, for me, that's the idea that self energy has its own, when it's really allowed to fully be embodied, it's like there's a certain warmth or heat or fullness we could feel inside when we're really embodying our self energy. And then also that from that place when we were able to allow arousal to happen, um, and it may get to a certain point and subside. It may not get super hot and steamy, but sometimes it really may, or maybe often it does, but that there can be kind of a self, um, like self can sort of be with us, be in it with us when there's a state of high arousal.
Totally.
That to me also is like flow state, immersion. You kind of lose everything else, everything else is offline. There's just sort of like a very deep flow state, might be an
Totally.
aspect of that.
Yeah, and that
Um,
makes me think about something I've heard Betty Martin talk about, of like how we all have an internal ceiling of the amount of threat pleasure that our systems will let us experience.
mhm,
And probably a lot of us are familiar with that sort of the internal feeling of like being too much that can
mhm,
happen when we start to hit that threshold, or like of I'm taking too long, or
yeah.
I'm being too much right now. It's like protector parts can come in to try to deal with that overwhelm and take us down. But I think the more expansion that happens around this, the more sort of permission is created for that steaminess to be there.
Yeah. And I'm, kind of, I think BDSM can offer opportunities to go deeper into that, because I think sometimes, like, because everything
is negotiated, like that negotiation can give the freedom maybe to go further into that, or
Definitely.
to really speak to someone. I'm thinking, I guess, even if more um, like group spaces, maybe where you could work with someone who's not your regular partner, who has some level of skill beyond what you've experienced, or is able to like guide something that's different, that might allow something to be experienced beyond
That
what was in your
transcendence.
repertoire.
Yeah, that transcendence can happen. That happens inside the power exchange of like where my limits for myself, my ceiling is, we get to transcend my ceiling because I could kind of get to experience it on someone else's terms. I think of that movie, Baby Girl with
Mhm.
Nicole Kidman and Harris Dickinson, which I'll say for the record is like definitely not a, I would not say it's an ideal depiction of BDSM for multiple reasons, but I'll try not to spoil anything, but there's a scene that happens when they first hook up, and we've seen the main character played by Nicole Kidman like orgasming or faking orgasms in her marriage. And it's very kind of girlish sounding, like this very kind of high
Mhm.
pitched, shallow moaning. But in this dominant and submissive encounter, she is going in the experience like being receiving this like sexual dominant sexual attention, and she first says like, oh, it's like, I think she says like stop or it's too much, and then she's kind of gets like coached to go beyond that, and she gets to transcend that ceiling and cascade into this like overwhelming pleasure. And it's so guttural, it sounds
Mhm.
really primal, like really guttural and primal. And I think she says like, I'm gonna pee, and then my inference is that she squirts. I think
Mhm.
happens for a lot of people with squirting of like, this is too much, I'm gonna pee, but then getting coached beyond that is what allows them to experience the release. And when I watched that scene, I thought this was definitely written by a woman. Like this just feels so realistic.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
you know?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's a great example. Yeah. Um, and then the last S is satisfied. And
Mm,
from a self-energy standpoint, it's this idea that our self-energy is satisfied already before we do anything, right? Like that our self-energy is whole and complete. We don't add to it, we don't take away from it. And so
mhm.
knowing that we're enough already, I think can be really powerful awareness, to start from. And I also like to help people experience, just explore for themselves. How do I know that I'm satisfied? What does that mean to
Mhm.
me? Is that synonymous with orgasm? Is that a physical release? Am I ever satisfied in other ways? And from a self-energy standpoint, again, we could be with our parts that are satisfied and be with parts that might be frustrated or shameful or less than satisfied, but our self-energy is still whole and complete.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with me.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
think that tracks really well the sort of the trajectory of what can be experienced inside BDSM as well. Yeah, all the way to the satisfaction. And I think about aftercare and the importance of aftercare, that and the space of integration too, where it's about really like resting in the satisfaction of the experiences and integrating them, not just sort of chasing highs or
Mhm.
like being in a place of like frenzy where it feels like it's never enough. Yeah,
Right. And how to learn or integrate from any kind of experience. And I think this is similar to what happens in psychedelic spaces, or, anything where there's, if there's sort of an allowing of an experience to happen. And then, I mean, even just regular dating and we could apply this to anything in life, really, which is okay, do I like how that went? How am I feeling after this? What are my different parts have to say? And then what's here for me from this experience? Like, what's here for me around this? What can I learn about myself, or what did I discover? Or, there's always a way that we can, like relate with what is really happening and has happened in a way that
totally.
helps us to like really deepen our relationship with
Yeah.
ourselves.
Yeah, I love that, especially thinking about being self-led in a BDSM context. And what it means to, not just identify with the great scenes that have gone really well, but also be able to include the scenes where things fell flat or it didn't really work or it something went wrong, and be able to really be in touch with like the learning from that, what we can take away from that, not have to like throw those experiences away, but be able to like
Yeah.
include them in our own stories of being sexual explorers. Yeah.
Mhm. And I think it's so easy for like shame to slip in right there. Like I wasn't good enough or something happened, someone's upset with me, or
Right.
like consent slip ups, those happen.
Like we had a misunderstanding.
We
I
had a
thought this was
misunderstanding.
okay and it wasn't. Yeah.
Yeah. And that can bring on so much shame, and then parts can go full circle here. So part can sort of beat up another part with shame, so then what, so how do we just be with that in a spacious way?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's see. Is there anything more that you would want to say that we haven't touched on yet at
I feel
this
like we've covered a
intersection?
lot of ground. uh, this has been great. No, I don't think so. Thank you so much for
Mm.
talking about all this with me. It's been really rich.
And I just want to appreciate that you reached out to me about this topic, and it's one that I've been wanting to include for quite a while on the podcast. And as I said to you, it just hasn't worked out for a variety of different reasons. And it's such a delight to meet you. And I love how you've expressed a lot of things before and during this conversation.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for being receptive and saying yes. I'm so glad we got to do this.
And is there anything more you'd want to let people know about what you offer or how they can find you? And there will be some stuff in the show notes, but so they can hear it now.
Yeah, people can find me at my website, rewildingtheheart.com. I do therapy with folks located in California, coaching with people elsewhere. And yeah, I've do, both therapy that includes IFS along with other modalities. And also when folks are really in the right place for it, I'm also open to doing sort of what I call ritual BDSM work, where we get to not with the people I'm doing therapy with. This is sort of a different offering, but yeah, for people who want to have an exploration of these things with someone who's psychologically minded and in a place to guide experiences within certain limits, I also welcome them to reach out.
Fabulous. All right. Well, thank you Oh, I almost left out my question that I like to ask all my guests before we end, which is if you'd like to share something that you find pleasurable in life that maybe you haven't mentioned yet today.
Well, it's spring here in Vermont, which comes very late. So for me, there's a deep erotic pleasure in playing in my garden right now and seeing what is coming up every day, and getting to exercise. I guess some of I feel like I'm in some power exchange relationships with the poison ivy that's coming up, who I'm approaching very respectfully while also asserting my boundaries. Yeah, just getting to absolutely relish in the ecosexuality of nature is always brings me joy.
Lovely. Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much,
Thank
Leonore.
you.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to the Self-Led in Bed podcast. Check us out at www.patriciarich.com/podcast, where you can sign up for a free guide to the 6 S's of sexual self-energy. And if you liked this episode, please subscribe and share it with a friend. Until next time.